Hello and welcome to the Tough Girl podcast, which is all about motivating and inspiring you. I'm your host, Sarah Williams. Today, I'm delighted we're going to be speaking to Elspeth Beard, and she was one of a select band of bold women to ride a motorcycle around the world, and she was the first English woman to do so. She achieved this feat a quarter of a century ago in the days before sat-nav, internet, email and mobile phones. Introduce yourself and tell everybody a little bit more about you, what would you say?
Oh my goodness. Well, I mean, I think I've led a very full life. I've always tried to sort of make every day count, and I've always tried to be to be active, to do things. I like challenges. I always like to to take on a new challenge, whether it's in my architecture or with traveling. I feel very strongly that that women need to fight for our place, and I try and do it, but I try and do it in a sort of quiet way. I think it's important. If we want respect, we have to earn the respect, and if we want to earn it, we have to prove it, and we have to prove it by doing things, not just by talking about doing things. And that's what I've tried to do with my life.
Where do you think this drive came from? I mean, could you take us back to your childhood and growing up? What was that like?
Well, I grew up in central London. Both my parents were doctors, and I had probably a slightly unusual childhood. I mean, my father was a very eccentric psychiatrist, and my mother was a chest doctor. And they very much left us to do our own thing when we were growing up. We were given a huge amount of freedom, but it was sort of, kept within certain boundaries. But we were certainly in our early teens, we were encouraged, I think, to explore and to push the boundaries a little bit. I mean, all our family holidays in the kind of 70s and 80s were, my father had this absolute obsession with, seeing everything in the Michelin guide. So we'd go on these mad holidays in northern France, where we would just literally spend all day, every day in the car seeing church to altarpiece to, just so he could tick all these things off in the Michelin guide. So, I learned about traveling and seeing things, and I suppose that gave me a fairly inquisitive mind at a very early age. I mean, I was sent off to school when I was actually sent off to boarding school when I was very young. So a lot of my childhood was spent away from home, but it was very happy home, but it was slightly unusual, I think, to have been brought up the way that we were.
I suppose, when did the love of motorcycles come in, or how did motorcycles enter your life? Because I can't imagine that was a thing that you did at boarding school.
No, when I was 16, I was actually expelled from school, and so I finished my A-levels at a sort of crammer in London. And that's where I really met a lot of my kind of core friends that have stayed my friends for life. And when I was there, I met Nick and Rick, and they had a sort of off-road motorbike. And when I was about 16, they asked me whether I wanted to go down to the Salisbury Plain, because they were just going to kind of ride around sort of off-road. So I went down there, and that was the first time I'd ever ridden a bike. And I can't say at the time I kind of fell madly in love with it or anything. It was probably about a year later when a friend of mine was having a small Yamaha YB100, and I needed sort of transport to get around London because I was at art college. So I bought it off him, and I just saw it as a cheap and efficient way to get around town. And then after about a year of riding that, I got a little bit bored of it. So I bought myself a slightly bigger bike. I got myself a Honda 250. And then it was really when I bought the Honda 250 that I started to realize the sort of potential, the traveling potential of a motorbike. Because I started to go slightly further afield. I went down to Brighton to visit my grandmother. And then a year of having the Honda 250, I then thought, now I want a slightly bigger bike. So I bought myself my BMW R60/6, which was the bike I eventually ended up, riding around the world.
You sound, getting expelled at 16 and then getting involved in motorcycles. It sounds like you were a bit of a rebel growing up. Would you call yourself a rebel?
I don't think I was I wasn't. I did it all very quietly, if you know what I mean. I didn't really make a big song and dance about it, and that's where my parents were great because they didn't try to stop me. They sort of allowed me to, to flourish, and they allowed me to do the things I wanted to do. Although I mean, my mum hated motorbikes, but she didn't stop me. They never stopped me from doing anything. They would always advise, and they were always there to guide me, but they never actually tried to stop me from doing anything. I don't know. I suppose. I mean, I very much kept to myself. I just did my own thing. Really, I didn't really think about it. I just did what I wanted to do.
Yeah, which is awesome. And I love it because I think so many girls, especially these days, are almost so worried about what other people think about them or will think about them or will judge them that it stops them going out and living their life to the fullest. So you've sort of been on this, motorcycle journey. Gradually, the bikes are getting bigger, from the Honda 250 to the BMW R60. You're starting to realise the travelling potential. When did you start going on bigger and bigger trips, and how did it sort of evolve?
Pretty much straight away when I got my BMW, I went up to Scotland on my own. So it was about a 2-week tour of Scotland I did, and then and then after that I did a tour of Ireland. But the next summer I did a sort of 2-month tour of Europe, and then the year after that my brother was in New Zealand. He'd been picking apples, and I persuaded him to meet me in Los Angeles, where we bought a bike. It was an old R75/5 BMW again, and we rode it from Los Angeles across to Detroit. So that was a sort of 2-month or 10-week trip riding across America. That to me was my kind of sort of trial run. That really was my first big trip. It was very useful for me because it was the first time I sort of learnt about looking after myself on the road and budgeting for everything and just learning to travel. And I could do it sort of with the comfort of doing it with my brother there as well. So it was a good introduction. And then it was the following year after that I left on my round the world trip.
So what did you love most about travelling by motorcycle?
To me, it sort of gives me an amazing sense of freedom. And I think riding a motorbike, riding my bike, I feel it sort of gives me a real sort of inner strength. I feel that nobody can stop me. I can go where I want. I can do what I want. I can stop where I want. It's just entirely in sort of my world, which I have complete control over. And that I only ever get when I'm riding my bike, that feeling of total independence and freedom, where I've got nobody telling me what to do.
I can so get why that would be addictive, and I can see why your trips and journeys have started to get longer and longer and longer from the 2-week tour of Scotland to from LA over to did you say Detroit?
Yeah, Detroit, because my aunt lives in Detroit, which is why we stopped there.
When did you start thinking bigger? When did you start thinking, do you know what? I could be the first English woman to go around the world. When did that seed get planted, or when did those thoughts start coming in?
I had absolutely no idea when I did it that I was the first English woman to ride around the world. That was nothing to do with why I did it at all. It was something that I wanted to do for myself. It had nothing to do with trying to be the first this or anything, because I didn't even know. I only found out in 2006 that I was the first English woman to ride around the world. So I had absolutely no idea of that when I did it. I was studying architecture, and I just finished my first 3 years architecture, and I'd come out with I'd been kind of, after I'd done the trip to America, the sort of seed was sown. I thought, I wonder whether it'd be possible to ride my bike around the world. But I never kind of really thought I would actually do it. But it was sort of there that, and I don't know where it came from. It was almost, I'd kind of set this challenge for myself. So I finished my architecture degree and I didn't do particularly well. So I had all these doubts whether I should carry on doing architecture or not, or whether I was doing the right career. And that was combined with me having a very painful breakup with Alex, who I was seeing at the time. So those two things just sort of happened at exactly the same time. And I just thought, this is it. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I felt slightly lost. I needed a kind of major distraction to get, so I wasn't constantly thinking of my broken heart. So I instantly started planning to go on the trip. And I think I finished at university in the May. I started booking I think I split up with Alex in the April. I finished my degree in the May. And then literally June, I thought, right, now I'm going to ride around the world. And I left that October. So between June and October, I worked every day, every night in a pub. And I saved £2,500. And then I crated my bike up and that was it. I was off. I left on the 2nd of October, 1982.
1982. And how old were you at that point?
I was 23.
23 years old, heading off on this incredible adventure. When you said from June to October, how much planning had gone into that? Had you mapped it all? I mean, because obviously this is going back when, I don't even know how you do it without the internet.
I didn't really plan anything. I mean, literally, I just thought, right, I'll get myself to New York. So I actually went around I went across the States first. And I did that because that was a kind of known quantity, because I'd already ridden across America the year before. I sort of felt that was a good starting point. I mean, I was very, very nervous. I didn't have a clue what I was doing. The preparation for my trip. My bike when I left was it was already 8 years old and had 45,000 miles on it. So it was an old bike when I left before I'd even started, and I didn't really. You can't think about now I'm going to ride around the world because that would just be too scary. So you have to just break it down. And so I thought, right, I'll just get myself to New York and I'll get my bike to New York, and then I'll just take it day by day and week by week and country by country, and I'll just see how far I get and where I get to. I mean, I knew I was, with £2,500, I knew I was going to have to stop and earn some money somewhere along the way. But I hoped that money would get me to Australia or New Zealand, where I could, earn some more money. But I didn't really have any sort of great global plan or anything. It really was just taking it each step at a time. I mean, when I left, I didn't actually think it was possible to ride around the world. And I know now in these days, when the world's a much smaller place, that probably sounds like a very strange thing to say. But in those days, when you really couldn't get you couldn't find out anything about any countries at all. It was really difficult. So it really was a question of just, arriving somewhere and finding out. So it was a real sort of unknown. But I quite like that. I think nowadays, there's almost too much information out there. It almost spoils the kind of, the adventure in a way, because it's all, you can plan everything down to the last detail. I think it can become a bit boring, if you know what I mean. It's
really interesting when you do visit new countries now, because I like my planning, I like my research, so I would be on the internet, I'll be checking out TripAdvisor, what are the top things to do, which are the restaurants you want to eat at, and you sort of know everything before you even get there, and sometimes you do lose that, I don't know, it's like when you used to just go and get lost and you'd come across these amazing little quirky cafes or amazing little places in the middle of nowhere.
Exactly.
What were your friends saying to you before you left? I mean, was this, because I can imagine, back in the 80s, 1982, 23 years old, I don't even want to say, being a female, but back then, I'd imagine times were very, very different. And what were the responses that you were getting when you told people this is what you were going to do? I
think my friends, they were all just slightly bemused by it all. I don't think I don't actually think any of them thought I would actually do it. I think some kind of thought, they would kind of listen to me when I talk about what I was going to do, but it was almost sort of, yeah, well, she won't really do it, or yeah, well, she'll be back in 3 months or whatever. I don't really think most of them actually thought I would do it. And my parents, my mum did everything she could to stop me, because she actually threatened to disinherit me, because it's her last ditch attempt to stop me from going. But my father, he never really said anything. And I think secretly he was quite proud of what I was trying to do, but almost couldn't show that because he knew that my mum was so against it. And I think she was just against it. She was obviously really worried, and I don't think she was trying to stifle my, what I wanted to do with my life. I just think she was just really frightened of all the things that could happen to me, she was a very worried mother. So,
you sort of say that, your mum was worried. Were you worried? What were the fears that you were dealing with before you left?
I did have lots of fears. I think traveling as a woman on your own, you are seen as a sort of easy target. But I do think it's possible to kind of minimize the risks. I think, how you hold yourself, what you wear, and how you interact with locals, and how it's all very important to minimize the possibilities of things happening to you. I think I had two fears, really. I think one was being kind of raped or mugged and left on the side of the road somewhere. That was one of my fears. And another fear was actually coming off my bike, having an accident, and just lying in a ditch on the side of the road and just dying, because there were no phones. Nobody knew where I was. I couldn't contact anybody. I was entirely on my own. And, and that's it. This is the reality of it then, that if something like that happened, there was a good chance that you wouldn't come back. But it was that element of it that I found quite exciting. It was because it sort of pushes you to do everything you can to ensure those things don't happen. I think it sort of sharpens you up, if you know what I mean. I
think you're absolutely right. I suppose it's that element of the unknown. Going across, so your first bit of the journey was, heading over to New York. You sent your bike over. You then flew over. I love New York. I think it's just like such an amazing, vibrant city. Had you been to New York before, or was that your first time in New York once you got over there? I had been to New York before, and when I went there to pick my bike up, I honestly didn't do any sightseeing at all. I think I stayed in this grim hotel room and just spent the whole time going down to the docks and dealing with the customs officials trying to get my bike out of the docks. So I didn't really, I really was on a mission. And, I wanted to get back because New York was expensive to stay. My funds were really limited. So I just wanted to get out to New York as quickly as possible and get on the road as quickly as I could. So from that journey from New York down to Los Angeles, what were the highlights from that? I sort of liked America, but I think because I'd been to it before, there weren't any sort of surprises. I loved New Orleans. That was great. That was a very vibrant city, and that was fantastic. Because I travelled up, from New York, I went up to Niagara Falls, which was great. That was fantastic. And then I went down to Detroit, where I stayed with my aunt, and then went straight down to New Orleans, which I loved. Parts of New Mexico, Arizona, I really enjoyed those because they were just these fantastic open spaces. And then Los Angeles, again, I'd been to Los Angeles because I'd met my brother there the year before. So LA again I just saw as a kind of port to sort out my bike, to get it crated up, to get it on a ship, to get it to New Zealand or Australia. You got to LA. How was your confidence at this point? Because, I know you'd been through like America before, but were you now sort of had anything happened? Had any of your fears you hadn't crashed or anything on the way down? I didn't have any accident.
going across America. I got hassled by this sort of gang of bikers when I was riding through, I think it was Arizona or New Mexico, I can't remember. And they kind of rode up behind me, and then they tried to box me in and drive and steer me off the road. And so that was slightly scary. But apart from that, I don't really think. I mean, I got, it's the usual sort of things that women have to put up with on the road. But I did find America a very strange country, because on the East Coast, I felt that they sort of tended to see anybody on a motorbike as trouble. I mean, I would turn up at petrol stations and with my helmet on, so they wouldn't see I was female. And they just wouldn't serve me. I'd just be completely ignored. And then the minute I took my helmet off, they'd kind of rush over and go, "Oh, sorry, ma'am," and all this kind of thing. And then they'd give me some petrol. And then I'd speak English. And then they would say, "Oh, my God, you're from England," and all that kind of stuff. And then so it was this kind of very strange. And then I'd go to the next petrol station, and it would be the same thing again. I'd stand there with my helmet on, and I'd be completely ignored. They just didn't want to serve me. So I had to show that I wasn't some greasy, dirty, troubled biker that was going to actually get them to accept me. And then, of course, that completely changed on the West Coast, because there they all ride bikes, and so America's a very diverse country, and the way I got treated all along, all across America, it changed, the whole way.
So what happened after LA? Where did you head to next?
When I got to Los Angeles, I didn't have that much money, and to ship my bike to New Zealand was really expensive. So I shipped the bike straight to Sydney, and then I flew to Hawaii first for a week, and then I flew down to New Zealand, and I spent 6 weeks in New Zealand, just sort of hitchhiking kind of the North and South Island. And then I flew from Auckland to Sydney, where I was reunited with my bike. And then I stayed in Sydney because I literally arrived in Sydney with $50 left. That's it. And I lived in a garage in Sydney, which I was paid $20 a week. So I lived in this garage with my bike, and I got 3 jobs. I was there for 7 months working, and I saved $6,000. And that was the money that got me home.
Oh my God, that's absolutely awesome. I can't imagine what it would be like, because I think these days, I don't know, did you have like credit cards back in those days? It sounds like a really stupid question, but it's just like...
No credit cards, no, nothing like that. You had nothing to fall back on. I think because my parents had been so anti me doing the trip, and so anti, and so against me doing the trip, I was absolutely determined I was never going to phone them up and ask them for help. I was not going to ask them for any money. This was something I was going to do on my own and prove I could do on my own. So I had no backup. In my mind, I had no backup. I mean, I'm sure if the chips were down and I was dying in some hospital, of course I would phone them up. But, in my mind, that was not an option. I was on my own, and I was going to do it on my own.
So when you were at Australia is a massive, massive country. And I've done a lot of travelling from sort of Melbourne over to Sydney, all up the Gold Coast, and then I've been to Perth and Ayers Rock and stuff. Where did you decide to go, or how did you decide what route you were going to do or what you were going to go see?
Well, I sort of did a big loop from Sydney. I headed up the East Coast, up to Queensland. I knew I wanted to see Ayers Rock, so it was a question of what was the most interesting way, I suppose, to get to the centre of Australia. So I decided to go up the East Coast, and then I cut across through Queensland into the Northern Territory, and then travelled south I went to Ayers Rock, and then down to Port Augusta. And then from Port Augusta, I rode across the Nullarbor, across to Perth. So it was but I mean, there aren't that many roads in Australia, so it wasn't too difficult to plan the route.
And did you go around Ayers Rock? Did you climb Ayers Rock when you were there?
I did indeed. I think I climbed it twice, actually.
Oh, it's amazing. It's a beautiful part of the world. I mean, I suppose how I'm looking at it is like America's almost, it's English speaking. You've been there before. Australia, again, it's almost very British, or it's very is very similar to what you would expect. Like in the UK, I don't think there's that much sort of culturally different from it. When did things start getting a bit more challenging for you in terms of traveling, as in, you weren't able to speak the languages?
Yeah, so from Perth, I decided to ship my bike straight to Singapore, and then I travelled through Indonesia on foot, on public transport, because again, it's a whole series of little islands, and it's really difficult to ship your bike from island to island to island. So I shipped my bike straight to Singapore, and then I flew to Bali. And although that was probably the first place I'd been to that wasn't sort of English speaking, I mean, lots of Australians go there on holiday, so it didn't really feel like a particularly foreign place, if you know what I mean. And then I suppose when I was traveling through North Sumatra, that was probably the time where I wouldn't say I was out of my comfort zone, but it was certainly eating food I'd never eaten, seeing those amazing buildings and the cultures and the people, and nobody spoke English. So, I mean, that was very interesting. I mean, I loved all that. And then from North Sumatra, I was reunited. I travelled down to Singapore and was reunited with my bike. And then I rode my bike from Singapore up through Malaysia and then into Thailand. And I went right up to the Golden Triangle, right at the northern point of Thailand. And I suppose it was really Malaysia and Thailand when I was riding on my bike that like if there was a problem with my bike and I had to try and find somebody who could fix one of my diodes, and I would have to try and explain it all to them. They didn't speak any English, I didn't speak any Thai, and I suppose those were the first countries where it was, I really felt as if I was traveling in a different world than what I'd known.
Well, were you meeting many other travellers as you were going? Were you meeting other like backpackers or other motorcyclists along the way?
I didn't meet any other motorcycle. Well, not yet. I did meet I did meet somebody when I was in India, but you see, people didn't really do trips like that on motorbikes then. I didn't meet any other long distance motorcyclists at all, and it was a very strange thing. Because I would sort of turn up at these sort of backpacker places, but I always felt I was slightly not ostracized, but they all looked at me as if I was a bit strange because I was on this motorbike. And I sort of never felt I belonged anywhere, really. I didn't belong with the other backpackers because I was on a motorbike and I wasn't really one of them. I didn't belong with motorcyclists because there weren't any other motorcyclists riding around then. I didn't belong with the locals because I was a foreigner. I didn't kind of really feel I belonged anywhere, and it was a strange. I mean, it was quite lonely, I have to say. It was quite there would be weeks and weeks where I wouldn't actually speak to anybody. I wouldn't have a conversation with anybody in English. And I remember after I'd spent 3 or 4 weeks traveling right up to northern Thailand, and I came back down to Bangkok, and I was in this backpackers hostel, and I almost found it difficult to talk because I'd forgotten how to string a sentence together. It was very strange.
From Thailand, what was the route that you took back to? I imagine you took it back to Europe. What route did you take?
Well, when I was in Thailand, I tried to get into Burma, but Burma was closed. You couldn't. All the land borders into Burma were shut. So from northern Thailand, I had to ride all the way back down to Malaysia, and then I took a ship from Penang in Malaysia across to Madras in India, and then from Madras I rode up to Calcutta, and then I rode up to Kathmandu in Nepal. And then my parents actually came out to meet me out in Kathmandu, which was great. I hadn't seen them for 2 years, and they came out to meet me. And then I did a 3-week trek around the Annapurna circuit, and then I went back into India. And then I travelled all around India, and then through Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, Greece, and Europe, and back to London.
Amazing. So when you look back at that segment of your trip, which was the bit that stands out for you as being one of the most challenging times that you faced?
I think the most challenging country I found was India. I found it extremely difficult travelling in India, especially on my own. I think it was just the sort of multitudes of people. who just never seemed to leave me alone. I was a real kind of focus of attention. I mean, 34 years ago, they'd never seen a motorbike like mine. I mean, all the bikes they'd seen were these little mopeds or Royal Enfields. They'd never seen a bike like mine. And I'd built these big aluminium panniers and top box when I was in Sydney. And so there was this extraordinary, I mean, to them, I mean, they almost looked at me as if I'd sort of dropped from outer space or something. So there was this extraordinary motorbike that they had never, ever seen before. And then it was being ridden by this woman, and it was just kind of, they just didn't know how to deal with it. And so I was constantly followed and stared at. And I'm not talking about stared at by 5 or 6 people. It was like 30 people or 50 people. And you've got this whole kind of horde of 50 people following you down the street and watching every move you make. And when you get on your bike, it was that constant pressure of never feeling I was left alone. I found that really, really wearing. It really started to grind me down. And I found that really difficult.
How did you cope with that pressure? I mean, I can almost understand it. It was almost like you just wanted a break and just for you not to be on show and not to be stared at. And also, I mean, I'd think I'd find that quite intimidating as well if there's, crowds of people staring at me constantly. What did you learn from that situation?
I think the only way I could cope with it was to try and sort of cut myself off from it. So and I think I used to look forward to the times when I was actually, on my bike moving, because when I was moving, nobody could get to me, if you know what I mean. And so I would try but you couldn't even stop anyway, even if you stopped in a field in the middle of what you thought was the middle of nowhere in India. You hadn't switched your engine off for a minute when all these people would just sort of pop out from everywhere, and then you'd have a crowd of 20, 30 people around you within sort of 5 minutes. I mean, the only time I really got any peace was when I was in my hotel room or in my tent. And that was my kind of private time and my private space. But I think when it started off, it was as if it was something sort of quite amusing and, I can deal with this, it's fine, It really, really started to, I found it really difficult. And I was so desperate to get out of India, really desperate. And that was the hardest country. I really found it. And I was really ill in India because you couldn't get, you couldn't buy any bottled water then. So I was constantly ill. It was really hot. You had all this pressure of being stared at all the time. And I found it really difficult, very, very difficult. Plus the fact by then I'd already been on the road for a year and a half or 2 years by then. So I was always, I was getting starting to feel a bit tired and a bit weary. It was just a combination of all of that. I found it very, very hard.
I mean, and you talked as well about travelling through Pakistan and Iran. And what was it like crossing over the borders into those countries? I mean, going back then, was there similar issues that there would be, or these similar thoughts that people may have, is it going to be safe in Iran, especially? I mean, we've spoken to Lois Price, who recently she rode her motorcycle all through Iran. One of the most, she said it was one of the most amazing countries she's been to. I'd just be interested to go back to when you were in the 80s on your bike, traveling from India into Pakistan into Iran. What was that like? How easy or hard was it?
Well, I had a lot of problem getting out of India. When I was there, there was the storming of the Golden Temple in Amritsar, which is the capital of the Punjab state. And that is about 15 miles away from the only land border from India into Pakistan. So basically, the whole Punjab state was effectively closed to Westerners. So although the border was open, the state was closed. So you couldn't actually get to the border. I spent about about six weeks just trying to get out of India. And I was sent back to Delhi to get permits that didn't exist. And it was an absolute nightmare. And then finally, I sort of managed to get to the border, and I didn't quite bribe my way through, but it's a very, very long story. Anyway, I finally managed to get out of India. and into Pakistan. And because I'd taken so long to get out of India, my Iranian visa was about to run out. So I only had 2 weeks to ride all across Pakistan. And I think the year before that, Russia had invaded Afghanistan. So Afghanistan which had been the main overland route from Europe to India, had always been through Afghanistan. So that route had been, was now closed. So this sort of makeshift route there was this sort of makeshift route across the desert of Pakistan. So there was no road or anything. There were just sort of trucks going across this desert, Baluchistan. So literally I had to ride. So I had 2 weeks to get across Pakistan, and that was probably riding through Baluchistan was probably one of the hardest parts of the trip, because there was nothing. There was no water. There was just desert, and I just followed telegraph poles, trying to find the border post. Finally, I got to Taftan, which is the border town between Pakistan and Iran. And Iran, actually, Iran was great. I loved Iran, but I liked it probably because they had the most beautiful roads. And having been through all these terrible roads I've been riding on for the last sort of 8 or 9 months, I was only given a 7-day transit visa to get through Iran, because at the time Iran was at war with Iraq. So it was a slightly risky place to be travelling through, and there were lots of roadblocks everywhere and soldiers, and so I had to be quite careful. So they gave me a 7-day transit visa, and I had to ride, I think it was about 4,000 kilometres, I can't remember exactly. It literally, I barely stopped. I just had to ride every single day in order to get across the country within seven days. And in the middle of it, I got hepatitis. So unfortunately, that time, because I'd met up with this Dutch guy in India, and so I was travelling with Robert. So Robert and I travelled together through Pakistan and Iran into Turkey. And so fortunately, at that time, I had Robert to help me. So he used to literally carry me down the stairs and put me on my bike every morning and sort of push me off. And I'd just ride all day, praying I wouldn't have to stop because I didn't have the strength in my legs to hold my bike up. But anyway, so we managed to get to the border with Turkey. Because I'd been so ill, we'd actually overstayed our 7-day visa, and then they were threatening to put us in prison. And anyway, so we got out of that one, and then we got into Turkey, and then we rode through Eastern Turkey and through into Greece and back through Europe.
I'm almost feeling quite stressed because there's time limits. You've got to get through the countries really quickly. You're ill, you're dealing with hepatitis, you're so weak that you can't stand up, and you've still got to ride your bike. And I think for me as well, it would be that feeling of almost being lost or never knowing quite where I am or where I've got to get to and what's next. And I suppose it's that stress, or what I'm imagining as stress, must have impacted on you quite, mentally and physically. How did you cope with all of those pressures, especially when you are feeling ill and tired, and you've been on the road now for it must be just over 2 years. How did you cope with all of that?
I think you cope with it because you have to. I just, I always on edge. Every day I would just, in the morning I would just hope I'd get to the end of that day and I'd still be alive, and I would, and I wouldn't be too ill, or it really was living every minute of every day. And although it was very tough, it was also quite exciting. And because you really feel as if you're living life on the edge. Anything slightly is going to go wrong. The results could be catastrophic. And I think having that in the back of your mind the whole time, it sort of really sharpens it's difficult to explain, but it just, there's no room for error. You cannot make any mistakes. And I think that's a very good process to put yourself through. I think it's really important to to test yourself and challenge yourself. And if you don't do that, you never really know what you're capable of. You don't know what you can do, and you don't know your strengths and weaknesses unless you put yourself in those situations where you are, it's a life and death situation, and the buck stops with you. You have to sort anything out. You have to deal with any problems. You can't just pick up the phone and say, "Oh, I'm breaking down." You've got to fix your bike. I've found that has been a very useful lesson for me to have gone through that, and the way I approach many other things in my life since, that has stood me in good stead. That I know that I can sort of deal with anything. I know that there's nothing anybody can throw at me that I can't sort out, that I can't deal with. There are no problems that I can't solve. You can only get to that way of thinking if you've put yourself through, really, really testing yourself.
Were you still enjoying yourself through these challenging times, or were you getting to the point where you're just like, I want this to be over now. I want to be at home. I've had enough.
I can't say. When I was in India and I met Robert, this Dutch guy, and we fell in love, and we had a fantastic, a fantastic romance when we were together, and that was probably the highlight of my trip. And I think had I not had Robert to pull me through sort of getting out of India and Pakistan and Iran, I don't honestly know. I'm sure I could have done it, but it would have been a lot grimmer, if you know what I mean. By the time I was in Pakistan, I was ready to go home. I really wanted to go home. I think then I could start to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Although it wasn't actually until I crossed out of Iran into Turkey that I thought, actually, I've done it. I've actually done it. I've ridden my bike around the world. Because by the time I was in Turkey, to me, it was just a quick ride through Europe and I was home. And Iran was behind me. And Iran was always the country I think that I'd worried about most, because you'd heard all these terrible things about Iran, and it was at war with Iraq, and so there was this whole thing with Iran in my mind. Would I be able to get in? Would I be able to get through the country? And I think once all that was behind me, I felt confident that I'd done it.
What was it like getting back to London?
Coming back was extremely difficult. I mean, riding through Europe, it was such a culture shock, because when I was in Western Turkey, Robert got hepatitis, which he caught off me. We were stuck just south of Istanbul for about a month while Robert was in hospital recuperating. And it was November. So, we knew that it was getting really cold in Europe. And we didn't have any riding gear. I mean, all our riding gear in those days was pretty basic anyway. I'd been in really hot countries for almost two years. So we didn't really have anything that's going to withstand the cold European winter. So we left Turkey in, I think it was early November. And so it was a pretty quick journey through Greece. We went to Austria and then into Germany and then Belgium and Holland. And I think it was literally a week. We just raced through it, and we both wanted to get home. We were both ill, tired, cold. We'd run out of money. We just wanted to get home, and we actually put our bikes on a truck. We met this Turkish guy in Austria, and we actually put our bikes on the back of his truck to get over the Alps, because there was a half a metre of snow. And we were still in our kind of summer bike gear. I mean, it was ridiculous. Well, I was so cold. I think it was the coldest I've ever been. We used to ride for half an hour. That was that was the longest we could ride. And then we'd have to go in and warm up somewhere, and then we'd ride for another half hour because we were just so cold.
I always think it's strange is whenever I've come back from a trip, or when I went away on my gap year when I was 18 and I came back to the UK, it was like everything was still exactly the same. Everyone was still doing the same things in the same places, and nothing had changed. But I felt I'd changed a huge amount. What was it like for you getting back to London and seeing your friends again? You probably hadn't been in contact with them for was it 3 years that you were away for in total?
It was about 2.5 years. Yeah.
What was it like coming back? And I suppose the journey must have changed you a lot, and then almost coming back to the same time in the same place. Does that make sense?
No, it was exactly like that. I remember thinking nobody's lives had changed at all. The world had just gone on exactly the same as when I left, and I had gone through this incredible experience. It was impossible for me to actually relate to anybody. I couldn't. Initially people would sort of listen for the first hour about all my stories. And then you could just kind of see they understand. They didn't understand what it was like when I was trying to explain, then my bike broke down in the middle of the desert and there wasn't anything for hundreds and hundreds of miles and I had half a litre of water with me and I had to fix my bike. And they go, oh yeah, that must have been a bit difficult. It was really difficult I had nobody. I felt I had absolutely nobody I could talk to. And I felt very isolated and very, very lonely when I got home. And for the first 2 or 3 months, I think I just lived in a basement and I just never went out. I never went out. I never saw anybody. I never spoke to anybody. I just completely hibernated. And I just went through all my photographs of my trip and I tried to kind of almost to relive it through looking at all my photos. And then gradually, after about three or 4 months, I got a job. And over time, it sort of got better, but it was very difficult when I'd gone through everything I had and just nobody wanted to hear about it. All the bike magazines, nobody wanted to know. My family didn't want to know. And so I felt very, I'd almost done this whole thing that was just all in my head. It was all just in me, if that makes sense. And I couldn't share it with anybody because nobody was interested.
Did you mind me asking, what happened with you and Robert? Did you carry on dating after the trip, or was it one of those romances which just sort of finished when the trip finished?
Well, no, it was complicated. My whole love life was very complicated. When I was, so first of all, I left the trip because of Alex. And then about a month before I left London, I met somebody else. And he sort of followed me around the world. So he came out to Australia to see me, and we met again in Kathmandu. And I was with him in Kathmandu when I met up with Robert. Really, when I was traveling with Robert, it was very much, I'm involved with somebody, this is just a traveling thing we're going to do. But, it just didn't, that's not the way it worked out. So then when I came back to London, Robert was still very, I had really strong feelings for Robert, and we had such an amazing time traveling. But I think, and then I had to sort of choose really between Robert and my this other person who I'd been involved with, and they were so completely different. One represented freedom, the open road, excitement, and then the other person represented, they wanted to get married, have children, settle down. So I had these two kind of extremes, and there I was in the middle of it, trying to come to terms with just being home and what I'd done. And for a year I was very confused, and I stayed in touch with Robert for about a year. I think what I realized after time was that our relationship had worked because because we were traveling and because we were like a united team, sort of fighting our way through all these countries and fighting to survive every day. And that kind of pulled us together. And somehow when we came back to Europe and all that was taken away, it just really wasn't the same. And it was really sad and just sort of fizzled out gradually over a year, and then we lost touch. And then I learned in 2006 that he had bone cancer and died. So it was all very, very sad. But yeah.
For women out there who are listening, who are thinking, I want to go and do something epic. I want to go, whether it's to go travel the world, whether it's to go on a motorcycle adventure. What advice and tips would you give them? Just
go, because you will always. There are so many times where people think of umpteen reasons why it's not the right time to go, and you've just got to go. If you go and you get out there, you will realise how easy it is. It'll change you forever. Brilliant.
Elspeth, thank you so much for coming on the Tough Girl podcast and sharing your amazing journey and your incredible stories. It's it's been absolutely inspiring to learn more about the challenges you faced, how you've overcome them, what you've learned and how you've applied it to your life. Total inspiration for other women out there who are considering what challenge that they should be doing next. So thank you so much for sharing your amazing story on the Tough Girl podcast.
Thank you very much.
Hey tribe, I hope you enjoyed that episode and it's inspired you to go after your own personal challenge, goal, big dream, whatever it is, go for it. Live life on your terms. I mean, what an inspiring story. 23 years old, traveling around the world before the internet, before Google, before the iPhone. I mean, wow, it must just have been completely different. Now, Elspeth will be producing a book. A book is going to be coming out sometime over the next couple of weeks, so do make sure you look out for it. As soon as I hear about the book, I will be sharing it on the website. So please do go check out toughgirlchallenges.com. And on the website there, you can find details of all the previous women that I've interviewed on the Tough Girl podcast. You can find out more information about myself, the different books that I've written, from climbing Kilimanjaro, Tips to the Top, Tough Girl Sahara Challenge, when I ran across the Sahara Desert, 6 marathons in 6 days, as well as chalet hosting your step-by-step guide. Now, if you are interested in specifically in motorcycle trips, then go and take a listen to Lois Price, who's a British travel writer, and she has been exploring the world on her motorbike. Now, I interviewed Lois in May 2016, and I'll just give you a little bit of background about Lois and what she did. So basically, Lois was working at the BBC in 2003, and she decided she was just going to leave it all behind and take a trip on her motorcycle. She headed off to Alaska and started a 20,000-mile journey down to the southernmost tip of South America. And this was the start of many of her epic adventures. So when we get Lois on the Tough Girl podcast, she shares more about the reasons behind her decision, why she made it, the highs, the lows, what she learned along the way, and why she would encourage everybody to take a trip and go traveling, to just go and see the world. It's honestly an absolutely inspirational story. She's also written numerous books as well. She's written a book about her first trip through the Americas, Lois on the Loose, which has been published throughout the world. The second book she wrote was Red Tape and White Knuckles, about riding the length of Africa in 2006, taking the Sahara, the Congo and Angola. And then her third book, which I can't remember, it's completely slipped my mind, but she's also written, it's Revolutionary Ride, which is about her adventures in Iran. So please do go check it out. So definitely amazing and inspirational stories. And if you are enjoying these stories and you want to hear more of them, then please do consider becoming a patron of the Tough Girl podcast. What that means is that you give a monthly donation, whether that's $2 a month, which is £1.96, or $5 a month, which is around £3 a month, so less than 50p a podcast episode if you sponsor $2 a month, or less than £1 if you sponsor at $5 a month. And that helps me to fund for the running costs of the Tough Girl podcast. It helps me to pay for the media hosting, the website, the blog, all of these things which do cost time and money, and your support would be so appreciated. Just imagine how you'll feel listening to the podcast every single week and knowing it was because of you that the content was coming out. It was because of you that I've been able to interview over 100 women and share their stories and increase the amount of female role models in the media. And this is what it is about. It's about sharing these stories, these amazing, incredible stories of these women who do such incredible things and just don't get that recognition. And when women don't get the recognition, young girls and boys are growing up without the female role models. And that is just bad for all of us. So help me on this mission to increase the amount of female role models in the media. I'm doing it via the Tough Girl podcast and the blog, and you can come and support it through Patreon, patreon.com/Tough Girl podcast. It honestly makes a massive difference if you could contribute $2 a month. Thank you again for listening. My little challenge for you is to tell one friend about the Tough Girl podcast. One friend, one family member, one colleague, one member of your run club, your sewing club, whatever it is, just tell one person about the Tough Girl podcast. Show them how to listen to podcasts. Share your knowledge. Open this whole new podcasting world to them, because if they have got an interest, a passion, they'll be able to find a podcast related to that passion, whether it is sports related and running triathlons or swimming or running or something completely different. There will be a podcast to suit them. I obviously would love it to be the Tough Girl podcast, but there is so much amazing content out there. So please do tell a friend about the Tough Girl podcast. If you haven't left a review, then please do leave a 5-star review on iTunes. It helps more people to find the podcast. And thirdly, what do I normally tell people to do? So leave a review, tell a friend. And thank you for listening. Thank you for being an amazing listener of the Tough Girl podcast. And if you want to connect with other listeners of the Tough Girl podcast, then please do come and check out the Tough Girl Tribe, which is a closed Facebook group where you can connect with other listeners of the podcast. All of the information, everything you need to know is on the website, toughgirlchallenges.com. Thank you again for your incredible support. Have an amazing day. Wherever you are, whatever you are doing, just go for it. Live the best life possible. Take care. I'll speak with you next Tuesday for another episode of the Tough Girl podcast. All right, take care. Lots of love. Bye.